It's Croctober, the official celebration of Crocs fans like you. So whether you like to rock your classic clogs, get cozy and fuss-lined, personalize with your favorite Jibbitz charms, or even, dress up like a clog for Halloween, it's time to tell your story and share your style. Join the Croctober celebration with Crocs fans around the world. Go to crocs.com to discover the range of shoes and find a pair that's iconic like you. Crocs, celebrating you all month long.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
5:50 a.m., March 7th, 2000. A grim discovery was made in Wando, a small county in South Jeolla province. The body of a man was found on the road in front of a small bus stop, just 7 kilometers from his home. We can call this man Kim Sang-ho. He was a 52-year-old man who suffered from a bad leg that left him in chronic pain. The police secured the scene but immediately suspected a hit and run. At first glance, the scene had all of the indicators that Mr. Kim had fallen in the road and was hit by a car. There were small pieces of red plastic littering the area, the same kind of red plastic they'd seen typically at car accidents from a turn signal. However, as investigators examined the body more closely, they noticed something odd. There were no visible injuries or blood loss, typically associated with a person who was just hit by a car with enough force to break the car's lights. This inconsistency was enough that the police couldn't close the case as a hit and run. They decided to send the body in for an autopsy, and they were right to. What the forensic team discovered showed that this was not an accident. This was murder. Welcome to Korean True Crime, with me, your host, Mimi Mizigo. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. You can support Korean True Crime on Patreon. There are various tiers with some bonus content coming soon. Link is in the description. Lastly, join us on Discord for the occasional movie nights of films based off of real crimes. Link is also in the description. Warning: today's episode contains brief mentions of sexual violence. Listener discretion is advised. As well, a pseudonym will be used for the victim in this episode. The victim's identity has been kept private, and we will respect that. Kim Sang-ho's autopsy revealed that he had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.303%. Now, a concentration of 0.05% to 0.15% is considered impaired, which is typically where people try to be when they're drinking. This range is where a person feels relaxed, confident, or inebriated. Depending on a person's tolerance, they might have impaired coordination and various stomach issues like nausea. Higher than a 0.15% to a 0.3%, and you are in the zone of blacking out, losing memory retention, or being unable to walk. Kim Sang-ho's blood alcohol content of 0.303% meant that prior to his death, he likely was incapable of walking straight on the sidewalk, especially due to the fact he was left disabled due to polio. Sang-ho's bad leg left him with a limp, but he could still walk, just had some hindrance. On top of that, a 52-year-old man, regardless of his tolerance, He was at risk of alcohol poisoning or even falling into a coma with such a high blood alcohol content. However, it wasn't the alcohol in his system that led the police to believe that this wasn't a hit and run. A drunken man stumbling down the sidewalk and falling into the road was a probable series of events for a crash. The driver, afraid they'd hit someone who fell on the road, sped off, leaving behind the glass from their lights. But Sung-ho's body did not show signs of being hit by a car. Instead, they discovered a high dose of doxylamine in his blood. Doxylamine is also sold under the brand name Unisom in some countries. Doxylamine is an antihistamine that is sold as a sleep aid for short-term assistance with insomnia. It can also sometimes be prescribed to treat nausea or allergy-related symptoms, although it's typically purchased over the counter. Although it is possible that Mr. Kim had not known that you should not drink while taking this antihistamine, specifically because it can cause impaired thinking and increases the drowsiness effect of the drug. With a blood alcohol content of 0.303 and a high dose of doxylamine, Mr. Kim would have been effectively in a short-term coma. There was little to no possibility that he could have walked to the bus stop, or had even gotten off a bus at that stop. Without any signs that he consumed the medication and booze nearby, detectives were left to believe that Kim Sang-ho was murdered and his body was disposed of at the side of the road. Few people used this bus stop, making it a secluded enough spot to dump a body without being caught. But clearly, the body would be found by regular drivers or when the bus came again. The situation was odd. Perhaps the killer wanted the body to be found and hoped the police would just assume it was a hit and run. But if Kim Sang-ho was not hit by the car, was the glass even related to his death at all? Could it have been planted by someone to stage the scene? The investigation moved quickly, and 2 days later the police found their prime suspect, who had a strong motive for wanting Kim Sang-ho dead. On March 9th, at midnight, Kim Shin-hye was arrested for the murder of her father. According to the police, they immediately suspected someone close to the victim as the culprit, because the body had been transported. They first looked at immediate family and friends, many of whom had alibis for the day and night prior. However, Shin-hye could only say that she wasn't involved. No one had seen her that day, although she testified that she had been alone. Without an alibi, the police decided to look further into possible motives she might have had to hurt her father, and if there were none, they might have moved on to someone else. However, Shin-hye was the person who stood to benefit the most from his life insurance policies. Money is always a motive for murder, especially when a hefty life insurance payout is involved. It wasn't only Shin-hye, however. Her 19-year-old younger brother and 17-year-old younger half-sister would also benefit. Kim Sang-ho had divorced many years prior, so his ex-wife was not a suspect. She had no contact with her family for years. Shin-hye's arrest came the day after, March 8th, close to midnight, when she came into the police station with her uncle. The uncle told the police that Shin-hye was there to confess to the murder of her father. That was enough for the police to begin the arrest warrant. At this time, Shin-hye was 23 years old, and to describe her, she was inconspicuous. She was a gorgeous woman, with jet black hair past her shoulders. She dressed very modern and classy. When you think of a killer, she looked entirely opposite to what might be pictured. She worked as an actress in stage production. That is what made this even more chilling, that this young woman had planned to drug and murder her father and abandon his body on the side of the road. When the police began questioning her, she began to reveal what her true motive was. And with her confession, there's some controversy and doubt that has lasted for more than 2 decades. Shin-hye told the police that her father was not the man everyone believed he was. He was a monster. Just 2 months prior, Shin-hye's younger half-sister had come to her in tears. She told Shin-hye that her father had sexually assaulted her. Shin-hye was a very protective sister and believed her immediately. There was no doubt in her mind that her father had done this, because when Shin-hye was a child, she had also been sexually abused by her father when she was just in middle school. It infuriated Shin-hye to the point that she decided to get revenge for herself and her little sister. Following the confession, she made a plan to kill their father. First, she took out 8 different life insurance policies on her father to care for her and her siblings. 2 months later, on the night of March 6th, 2000, she visited her father late in the night, just before his body was found the following morning. She brought the alcohol and medication, but under the premise that she had mixed him a health tonic. Many health drinks have herbal medicine or natural ingredients that taste incredibly potent, so she didn't really need to hide the horrid taste of the drink. She offered the mixture to her father and he drank it, believing that it would be good for his liver. As he finished the drugged drink, she offered to take him for a drive in the car, and he agreed. As she drove, she waited for him to feel sleepy and doze off. As he lost consciousness, she pulled to the side of the road next to the bus stop. Shin-hye pulled her father from the passenger seat and left him lying on the road. If a car drove by and hit his dead body, the police would think that it was a hit and run. And she was right. The police did initially believe that that was what had happened. However, she hadn't thought that they would conduct an autopsy on the body, discovering the alcohol and sleeping medication in his system. The case was closed, and Kim Shin-hye was arrested. There isn't much to say about her trial because she confessed to the crime, and the Supreme Court found her guilty of murdering her father and disposing of his body. She was handed a life sentence and to this day is in a solitary cell at Cheongju Women's Prison. Cheongju Women's Prison is the only long-term prison for women in South Korea. But clearly, this is not the end of Shin-hye's story. For her first 15 years in prison, and possibly to this day, Shin-hye was known as Dokhanyeon. This nickname means stubborn bitch. She earned this nickname after refusing to partake in any prison work or hard labor offered to prisoners. This work is offered in exchange for a reduced sentence or parole eligibility. Because of this, she decided to rather live in prison for the rest of her life. Korean prisons often have shared rooms with 4 or 5 people, unless that person is a target for assassination, like a political figure, or has committed a violent crime and is likely to hurt a cellmate. Shin-hye was kept in a single occupant cell because she was a murderer. Then, she secluded herself by not participating in the work program. She was absolutely isolated for those 15 years. I say 15 and not 24, which it is now in 2024, because significantly after 15 years in 2015, the Korean Bar Association received her appeals and announced that they would be filing a lawsuit on her behalf for a retrial. Every single day Shin-hye was in prison, she was adamant that she was innocent. She never hurt her father. She told her lawyers, "I did not kill my father. I am innocent, so I have no reason to do prison work." She believed that she had nothing to atone for, and therefore refused to be used as free labor. Shin-hye didn't start suddenly claiming that she didn't kill her father after she was put in prison. Actually, she had never once confessed to killing her father. I know you must be confused because I just told you about her confession. But when reinvestigation began into her case, it was clear that no one had actually heard her confess to any of the crimes. Instead, the police presented her with what they believed to have happened, and she signed the testimony. She has never faltered that what the police report stated was entirely fabricated. In court, she also tried to plead her innocence, yet they found her guilty. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, but she was given a life sentence in August 2000, a few months later. 15 years later, she was asked again about her innocence, and she said, "I didn't kill him, so what do I have to reflect on? I don't want parole or a reduced sentence. You have to be guilty for that." Shin-hye was visited by attorney Park Jun-young and interviewed in 2014. Her story told that she was deeply upset about her father's death and that she never once told the police that she was sexually abused by her father, and that her sister had never said that either. So what was the truth? We have to go back to her arrest and learn what happened from her perspective. On March 6th, 2000, the day prior to the murder, at 6 p.m., Kim Shin-hye got into her rental car to return to Wando to see her family after she had brought her younger brother. They had come to Wando to visit their grandparents and father on March 1st, 5 days prior. They had only intended to stay for one night and then go to Seoul, but her younger brother wanted to spend more time with their grandparents. Shin-hye needed to travel back to Seoul for a friend's wedding, so she agreed to return to Wando on March 6th to pick up her brother. She went to Seoul and spent the 1st to the 4th there. Nothing eventful happened. Then on the 5th, she had a housewarming party for another friend in Gwangju. She had perfectly planned her routes and had printed out her maps and was ready for the busy week. But on the morning of the 5th, when she had started to travel from Gwangju to attend the housewarming party, she came out to her rental car and saw that someone had sideswiped the parked car and fled. She brought in the car to the service center and called her friend in Gwangju to explain the situation. She apologized and said, "I need to leave the following day, the 6th. The friend in Gwangju was really hoping she would be there that day and decided to reschedule the party for the following day, which is a Monday, when Shin-hye could make it. Because she had to wait for the new car, she had to call her brother and explain that the schedule had changed. She'd be getting him later than planned. She asked if he could take the bus up to Seoul and meet her there. She told her brother the party had been rescheduled and that she would send him money to take the bus. But her younger brother insisted that she pick him up and travel with her. This also added a little extra time to her travel because now she had to go pick him up in Wando. So she called the friend in Gwangju and said, "My brother's coming with me." She decided she would stay the night in Wando, her hometown, rather than driving through the night. And in the meantime, she could contact a few high school friends and ask them if they want to go shopping with her. Shin-hye was clearly an extrovert who enjoyed being with friends and family. I will add that everyone involved in her recollection of events has confirmed that this is true. On her way to Wando, she stopped at a rest area in Daejeon and called her father. Her father was drinking with two neighbors at home and told Shin-hye that he had made some chicken porridge for her that she could eat when she visited that night. The neighbors confirmed they heard this conversation while he spoke on the phone. One of his neighbors even scolded Kim Sang-ho for drinking too much that night and stated he would be seeing his daughters, so he shouldn't be drunk. Sang-ho seemed to be in a really good mood to see his daughter. He hadn't seen her in a while, and everyone in the family said that they had a very good relationship and talked often. People were so surprised when she was arrested because of how caring she was for her father through the difficulties he had with his disability. Kim Shin-hye drove all night and arrived to Wando at 12:55 a.m. on March 7th. This was 5 hours before her father's body was found. When she got into town, she stopped at a payphone and called her friends and asked them to meet up. But one of her friends was tired and didn't want to go out so late. She called everyone using a payphone rather than a cell phone because she didn't have one. She was saving up all of her money to travel and study abroad in Japan the next year. She tried calling a few other friends, but they didn't answer, presumably asleep. Then she decided to call her father and let him know she was coming since no one wanted to hang out. But when he didn't answer, she tried calling her grandmother, who also didn't answer. A lot of people in Korea stay up late, but most of the people she called were already asleep. When she tried calling the grandmother again, her younger sister answered. She was staying up late, drawing a cartoon, and watching TV. Shin-hye's little sister said she couldn't sleep because their father had come home incredibly drunk, which started a fight with the grandparents. The girls knew well that their father was an alcoholic who was known for having a horrible personality when he was drinking. He was not abusive, they said, but he just nagged people and liked to argue when he was drunk. He just wasn't fun to be around. Which makes the neighbors' advice for him to stop drinking make even more sense. They knew he was mean when he drank, and they were trying to tell him to be in a good mood when his eldest daughter came to visit. Shin-hye didn't want to come home to her father and get a lecture from him, so she lied to her sister and told her she wasn't close. Her lie, telling her sister that she wasn't nearby yet, would be the entire basis for Shin-hye's entire alibi being thrown out and the police declaring that she had no alibi for that evening, which no one could vouch for where she was because no one had seen her. When the police learned from the sister that Shin-hye had said she wasn't nearby, Shin-hye tried to protest and come clean that she lied to her sister because she wanted to avoid fighting with her father. She also thought her grandmother would be upset if she purposefully didn't come right to the house, so she wanted to give probable reason for why she was coming home so much later. Shin-hye wanted to stay out late in the night, so she kept trying to contact her friends and find something to do to avoid going home, but no one could hang out. This made her alibi of what came next really unreliable. She says that she visited a cafe alone and drank some wine and beer and then left to sleep in her car when the cafe closed. She had the slightly drunk decision to drive to her ex-boyfriend's house, where she parked nearby and took a nap. When she woke up, she saw that it was 5 a.m. She drove to her father's house and tried knocking on the door, but no one answered. She was shouting her father's name and calling out to him because she saw a light on upstairs. When no one answered, she went to her grandmother's home and slept until 7 a.m. This is when the police came and told them of Kim Sung-ho's death. None of this could be verified, though. If they had tried, they could have discovered if she was at the cafe until past 1 a.m., though. Also, if she was driving near restaurants and cafes, it's likely there was CCTV that would have shown her car. But none of this was searched for. Her friends had appeared in court and said that they did receive phone calls from her asking to hang out, but that they couldn't or didn't want to go out late. 2 girls cried in court and told reporters, "If only we had met Shin-hye that night, none of this would have happened. They wouldn't suspect Shin-hye, but the court won't treat our testimony seriously." The judge in the trial acted inappropriately and criticized the young women, scolding them, saying things like, "Don't you have anything better to do? Why are young women out so late at night?" He spoke to them like they were minors, sneaking out, or slut-shaming them for acting like adult women and having fun. Then there's Shin-hye's confession. The confession that might have been coerced out of her. The initial report was that Shin-hye had come into the police station with her uncle after confessing the murder to him. He had convinced her to turn herself in, and she agreed. Shin-hye says that this never happened. The police used this against her in court, but she told the judge she did not confess to the crime, and her coming to the police station with her uncle was not for her to turn herself in. Rather, at 11:20 p.m. on March 8th, an hour prior to supposedly coming into the police station, the uncle called her and began to yell at her. He threatened Shin-hye that he would tell the police that her younger brother murdered their father if she didn't confess to it. He told her he would send the boy away for life and that the police would never believe her. And ultimately, he was right. The police did not even care when she told them that the uncle had fabricated the entire supposed confession. Her arrest was quite literally based on a he said, she said situation. Then, the police began accusing her of all sorts of crimes. She felt that it didn't matter what she told the police, they just wanted to put someone away for this crime. Shin-hye would tell her attorney that she was subjected to threats, physical abuse, and verbal abuse by the police. They wore her down until she believed that there was absolutely nothing she could do to escape her fate. The murder, or death, was on her hands. And what attorney Park Jun-young, who interviewed her 15 years later for her retrial, what he would discover was that the documentation of her arrest and interrogation seemed like it was entirely different to what Shin-hye recalled. Even minor details were off, insignificant things. It was as if the interrogation in the documentation was recorded from an entirely different person, or was completely fabricated. The documents were photocopied in a thick stack of 563 pages. Most of these cases haven't been digitized, so Attorney Park had to read through everything. He wanted to find out, was Shin-hye telling the truth? Was her alibi correct? Was the sexual abuse a lie? And by whom? Could the police have pinned Sung-ho's death on his daughter with no evidence whatsoever? The official record stated, the defendant was unhappy that her father, the victim, would sexually abuse the defendant and her younger sister when he was drunk. She took out 8 life insurance policies, including insurance for motor vehicle accidents for about 800 million won. The defendant, at 1 a.m., gave the victim some liquor and 30 sleeping pills and told the victim to take them all as it was good for his liver. The defendant drove the victim around Wando until 3 a.m. when he died. At 4 a.m. the next day, the defendant disposed of the victim's body by dumping it in front of a bus stop 7 kilometers away from his home. That is what the police summarized the entire case into. However, it is in the details of the reports that we see mistakes and errors. Specifically, the first search and seizure report was on March 11th, 2000, 3 days after her arrest. A police officer visited Shin-hye's apartment where she lived with her younger brother in Seoul. The report states, at the suspect's home, the following items were seized: rice bowl cover, yellow dish towel, 3 notebooks, and 1 file used to grind up sleeping pills. The items were seized without a warrant, as the suspect's younger brother was present and consented to their seizure. Shin-hye's younger brother was questioned about this report, and he stated that while he was at the home, he did not know the police needed a warrant to search the apartment. They did not ask to enter or seize anything. They just presented their badges and entered with evidence bags. He didn't think he could object, so he just allowed it to happen. The attorney saw that this was just the beginning of the illegal acts perpetrated by the police. Then, on the report, several high-ranking officers' names were listed. The younger brother only remembered 2 men, who were not detectives or sergeants by any means. Attorney Park reached out to the officers listed on the report, and one of the officers stated that he had never been to Seoul in his life. He didn't participate in the search and seizure, and had no idea why his name would be on that report. Attorney Park was able to contact one of the officers who did attend the search, and he said that the Wando police station stated that they did not have enough investigative personnel to travel to Seoul and asked a low-ranking officer to conduct the search and gather any evidence they would think was involved in the crime. This officer didn't want to go alone, so he contacted a friend of his who was in the military, and together they conducted the search. But the report was filed by the Wando police station, who lied about both the consent of the brother to search the apartment and who really conducted the search. There was one more thing that was incorrect on just this form. There were only 6 items listed as taken. But when Attorney Park went to review the stored evidence, there were many more items in storage. Namely, many nude photos of Kim Shin-hye. Shin-hye's career was in acting and theater, but as a naive younger woman, she admitted a photographer had tricked her into taking nude photos to help her career. She had hidden the photos in her apartment, hoping that they would remain private. But the men who searched her apartment had turned her bedroom upside down, and when she found the photos, it was the perfect blackmail the police needed. The low-ranking officer who had searched her apartment admitted to taking the photos, but he wouldn't say anything more to incriminate himself. Shin-hye told attorney Park that the police station brought these nude photos in during her interrogation and started splaying them out on the table. They started passing them around the police station to other officers, detectives. Then they used these photographs to threaten Shin-hye into signing the falsified confession. To make matters worse, these photos were placed in Shin-hye's purse when it was returned to her younger brother following her sentencing. The police had placed them in her bag, knowing full well that her brother would see them when he opened her belongings. This was just another way to humiliate her and her family. As Attorney Park continued to read through the report, expecting much more wrongdoing, he noticed that the younger brother and younger sister had also been investigated. The brother and sister were both considered minors at the time legally, but in 2014, they were in their 30s, and they both remembered the abuse they experienced at the hands of the police investigators. The plot against Shin-hye allegedly began the day that she was arrested. There are 3 stories being told. First, the uncle's story that Shin-hye confessed her crimes to him. Second, the police's report that she confessed to her father sexually abusing her, and therefore she killed him. And third, Shin-hye and her siblings' stories that Kim Shin-hye did not visit the police station that night or confess to any crimes. Their story is that they visited the morgue to identify their father's remains. As the 3 siblings visited Hwando Daesang Hospital's morgue at 1 a.m. on March 9th, the day after the police stated in the report that she went to confess her crimes, at the morgue, the police were told by the uncle that Kim Shin-hye had confessed to the crime to him in private, and that's when the police came to the hospital and arrested her. Shin-hye had been interrogated on the 8th, but she wasn't arrested until they got an arrest warrant on the 9th when she was taken to the morgue. She had no idea she was even a suspect in the case, because when she spoke to the police on the 8th with the rest of her siblings, they were asking her about her father, not whether or not she had killed him. Shin-hye says that the police forced her into a patrol car from the morgue and drove her to the police station. At the station, in a typical arrest, the suspect is told their rights and why they were arrested. The suspect signs a document with their name and fingerprint stating they agree to the arrest conditions and that they confess, essentially. They write down everything that happened and they sign it. Shin-hye was confused and kept telling them that she didn't understand why they were accusing her of killing her father, but they had her there in handcuffs. They grabbed her hand and tried to force her finger into the ink, but she pulled her hand away. That is when the officer grabbed her even tighter and forced her finger to stamp the document. They also needed a signature, but she refused. The officer got upset when she refused to admit any wrongdoing and began to hit her in the head and slap her. Even the officers listed on the interrogation records weren't the correct officers who actually interrogated her. When Attorney Park was checking the records for accuracy and searching for the truth, he found none of the officers would admit whether or not they were involved in the actual interrogation. And some said that they were even surprised to see their names on the forms because they had not been present. It seemed that everyone involved was hiding the truth. During her first interrogation on March 8th, nowhere in the documentation of her interview does it say that the police were conducting a substantive examination with Shin-hye. This procedure is when a person who has been detained as a suspect is brought before a judge along with all of the documentation and evidence about their crime. If Shin-hye had confessed, they would have had to do this. The judge would speak to the suspect in custody and review the evidence of their crime and either grants the arrest warrant or denies it, and the suspect can leave. The suspect needs to sign this paperwork. That was the paperwork that Shin-hye was being forced to fingerprint and sign. But she was never brought in front of a judge for a warrant, and she never says she confessed. The paper was already ready for her on the 9th when she was arrested. However, someone did sign the acknowledgement of her arrest warrant, and it wasn't her. The police then went and visited her grandmother and told her that her son had died in a car accident. Grandma Kim was 82 years old and illiterate at the time. She didn't understand that the paperwork the officers had asked her to sign was actually an acknowledgement of her granddaughter's arrest warrant. Shin-hye was then arrested and brought in again for an actual interrogation. The officers demanded that she confess while slapping her across the face, hitting her in the back of the head, and demeaning her. Shin-hye says she kept wondering, is this because we're poor? If we were a wealthy or famous family, would we be treated this way? But Attorney Park in the Korean Bar Association would listen to her story. And in January 2015, the Korean Bar Association determined that the police had conducted an inhumane investigation, and a retrial was necessary. Shin-hye wrote a testimony about what really happened during the investigation. March 9th, 2000. She wrote that the investigation began without any words. Rather, an officer punched her in the face with a closed fist, and then again in the back of her head. He coldly said to her, "Let's record your confession and get this over with." He held up a recorder to her face and began asking her questions about her personal life, things that had nothing to do with the case. If she refused to answer, she was hit again. He asked her things like, "Where does your father keep his glasses? Tell me what's in the refrigerator at your Seoul apartment." They kept asking her nonsensical questions like this and hitting her each time she couldn't answer or refused to. Finally, she couldn't stand to be hit in the head any longer, and she could barely see out of either eye. The officer told her, "You have to sign this and put your fingerprint here. It's the law." She couldn't read what the paper was in front of her, so she signed and fingerprinted this falsified testimony. March 10th. The officer began yelling at her, "Your brother said you're the culprit, so why don't you confess?" This detective grabbed her hair and twisted her arms behind her back. She said the pain almost made her fall unconscious. He would kick her legs until she would fall, holding her by her arms behind her back. This form of torture is called strappado and is considered inhumane in every situation. This typically results in dislocated shoulders and nerve damage. All of this occurred while he shouted at her to confess. As time went on, she was unable to think through the pain. She was in a daze. The officer told her, "I will hit you for every second you do not answer me." He took off his sweater, wrapped his arms around her neck, and began to strangle her. March 11th. The same detective as the day before returned. He put a towel in her mouth and continued to beat her. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the ground. She tried to pull out the towel because blood was pooling in her mouth and she began to vomit. But he held the towel over her mouth and shouted at her to swallow. He laughed at her and asked her, "Is it delicious?" He enjoyed torturing her. She tried crawling towards the door to escape, but was attacked again, this time on her knee. A large scar remains there to this day. This is happening at the exact same time her apartment was being searched. Later that night, they came back and threatened to spread all of her photos all over town, send them to her family, her friends, put them everywhere, and ruin her reputation. After hearing this recollection, Attorney Park had difficulty believing that this happened. He believed her. But it was so unfathomable that such evil existed in a person who swore to protect the public. Her family didn't visit her at the police station during this time because they weren't allowed to. But there was one man whom she recognized who had been at the police station and had seen her beaten and bruised. She remembered his name for so long because in prison, she kept writing down everything that she remembered. She wrote on the bottom of her socks, in the inside of her underwear, on the inside of her pants, because she'd already filled the notebook she was allotted. This man, Mr. Cho, remembered seeing her there. Attorney Park reached out to this man after searching extensively for him. The man answered the phone and said, "That was such a long time ago. I'm with my family now. Let's talk later." And then he ghosted. He didn't respond to Attorney Park for weeks. Park decided to show up at his place of work, hoping that he would have a conscience and admit to what had happened that day. Mr. Cho was shocked but agreed to say what he had seen. Mr. Cho must have been a suspect or was arrested at that time because he had only seen her through the interrogation window and then at mealtime. He said he saw the officers yelling and hitting her in the head. She cried in her cell all through the night and refused to eat. She kept her hair in front of her face and kept her head down so no one would look at her. He says that just by looking at her, he knew that she was innocent. The way she cried so defeatedly did not look like someone who could have killed anyone, or anyone who is confessing to their crimes, like the police said. One of her close friends, who she had tried to meet the night of the incident, Guan, had visited her in prison while she was awaiting trial at Haenam prison. They were shocked to see her so disheveled with hair missing in very large patches on her head. They asked if she had done this to herself, and Shin-hye told Kwon that the police had ripped her hair out. Shin-hye's younger brother told the exact same description. She was missing hair in large patches all over her head. When he tried to visit the police station and say that she was innocent, the police hit him as well. They cursed at him and accused him of conspiring to murder their father. They threatened to arrest him as an accomplice. When he returned the following day with their aunt to speak to Shin-hye, the same day Shin-hye was blackmailed, an officer ran up to the younger brother and just jump-kicked him in the legs and began threatening him and hitting him. He took the brother to his office and handcuffed him to a chair. He was interrogated for a half hour trying to get him to turn on his sister. They told him that Shin-hye confessed to the murder and said that she planned it with him. The brother had no choice but to say that his sister was lying. Some people doubted his story that he was beaten as well, but Attorney Park found a letter that he had written to Gwangju High Court stating that he had been assaulted by the investigating officers. He had sent this letter in December of 2000. No one who knew Shin-hye believed that she was guilty, except maybe her aunt and uncle who had said she confessed to them. But many of her family and friends supported her innocence. March 14th, 2000, an interview log was taken from the Wando police station with Shin-hye's aunt, who we can just refer to as Aunt Gim. Aunt Gim spoke to Shin-hye and asked her to tell her everything. She visited her at the prison. Shin-hye consistently said she didn't do it. She didn't lie. She said, "It'd be easier if I'd done it, but it's not true." The record ends with Shin-hye saying, "I told the truth, but they won't take my statement. They won't even treat me like a human being." Her aunt did not believe her and continued to try to press her to confess. The aunt and her husband, the uncle who allegedly had accused her, were critical witnesses in the trial. Both her aunt and uncle were reported as giving witness testimonies that Shin-hye confessed to murdering her father. When her aunt visited her in the detention center, her aunt scolded her for not confessing. She refused to believe that Shin-hye was innocent. This aunt was Sung-ho's biological sister. The uncle was his brother-in-law. She kept saying to Shin-hye that she murdered her brother. It was an extremely frustrating conversation to read because the aunt wasn't listening to anything Shin-hye was saying. She would just respond with, "You need to confess. You'll feel better when you confess. I'll wait for you to confess. I'll keep visiting you until you confess." The issue is, There's no record of Shin-hye calling her aunt and uncle like they said she had. The aunt and uncle's story also kept changing about how she confessed and what exactly she said. They were never questioned in court about the inconsistencies in their stories. Let's take a look at the first written record of their testimony. First, on March 8th near midnight, the uncle says Shin-hye confessed to him and he accompanied her to the police station. But another family member tells a different story. This family member says that during the time Shin-hye supposedly confessed to the aunt and uncle, the couple was actually at the funeral home with him and everyone else. Then suddenly, the aunt comes in and says, Shin-hye told me she was the killer. This happened a little bit before 9 p.m., 2 hours prior to the uncle saying she told him at 11:20 p.m. They also said they called the police station to report it. Now, this time difference could be a mistake of a 70-year-old man and woman, but then the younger sister's story also contradicts both of them. In later testimonies, the uncle fixes his story to say that she had confessed at the funeral hall closer to 9 p.m., but he didn't ask her about it until they were driving to his house, closer to 11:20 p.m., when he initially said she confessed. Then later, he changed his story to say he never asked for details because he was just trying to get her to the police station. Aunt Kim's younger sister, who technically is still Shin-hye's aunt, but that's going to get confusing, so we're just going to call her Aunt B. Aunt B went to Aunt Kim's home after the funeral rites at the hospital at 11:40 p.m. on March 8th. This is almost 3 hours after the aunt says that Shin-hye confessed, and 20 minutes after the uncle says that she confessed. Aunt B saw Shin-hye crying with her siblings at the funeral rites and then at the aunt's house. Shin-hye kept to herself and didn't speak to anyone the rest of the night. This is also during the time the police reported she had visited to make her confession. Nothing was adding up, but Aunt B and the family member at the funeral hall both said they saw no confessions during the time it supposedly happened, and Shin-hye did not go to the police station with the uncle that night. The officer on duty that night, who would have taken the report, was questioned by Attorney Park in 2015. He stated he had received a phone call from the uncle between about 10 p.m. and 11 p.m., stating that Shin-hye had killed her father. He remembered the time because he was watching a drama that only came on at 10 p.m. on Wednesdays and Thursdays. This means that the aunt stating that she called the police at 9 p.m. couldn't have happened. As well, it was the uncle who made the call, and he didn't visit at 11:20. If you're confused what is going on, so is everyone else involved. Yet this wasn't questioned in the trial. Keep in mind that Shin-hye also was threatened by her uncle to confess to save her brother's life, whom the uncle said had really killed their father. As Attorney Park went through the paperwork, there were 5 reports from the police and 6 by the prosecution. None of them listed exactly the same details. Some had different methods of murder, like what kind of liquor was consumed, what medication was used, or where his glasses were. There was this detail throughout all of the paperwork that the police were trying to locate the 2 drinking glasses that Shin-hye had used to drug her father's drink. Some of the reports even differed in how his body was disposed of or what her motive for the crime was. If she truly had confessed, wouldn't all of these details be the same? They had her confession, right? And her story wasn't changing constantly, at least there was nothing in the documentation that stated she was changing her story. There are many reasons this could have happened. The police fabricated everything, or they were piecing it together by forcing Shin-hye to confess to little portions of each confession. Then when all was said and done, they just had a large patchwork of lies. And what of the sexual abuse that Kim Sung-ho was accused of after he was dead? Alongside stating that she is innocent, Kim Shin-hye has insisted that her father is not a sexual offender. But Kim Sung-ho was branded a sexual offender after his death, something that tarnished his memory. Reputation holds such gravity, and Shin-hye's family were dealing with not only being branded a family of criminals, but also having the shame of having a sexual molester in the family. The younger sister was questioned about the alleged confession she made to Shin-hye, but she denied it. When the little sister visited the police station, she was also faced with violence alongside her brother. She told the officer that her father had never hurt her. Her father had never even physically disciplined her once. This officer tried to hit her in the back of the head, but she moved away, resulting in the officer getting angry. He kicked her hard in the shin, causing a cut that left a scar. She yelled at the officer for hitting her, and he then started accusing her of killing her father as well. When she was allowed to leave the police station with her brother, the officer bought her a drink and said he was sorry and that this was just part of the job and he hoped she understood. Understandably, she was upset. When she came in to sign her testimony about what she had witnessed, the statement contained nothing that she had actually said. It was full of lies. But the officer wouldn't let her read through it and forced her to stamp her fingerprint and sign the document. The document read, "In March 1988, when I was in my 3rd year of middle school, whenever my father drank, he would summon me and touch my body. He would try to take off my clothes, so I ran away. I didn't tell anyone about it until I told Shin-hye." The testimony also read that she and her siblings weren't sad that their horrible father was dead. However, in later documents about this testimony, the story changed. It read, "I was sexually assaulted by my father for the first time and last time in February 1999 on the kitchen table at 12:30 a.m. The testimony ended with her saying she was incredibly sad about her father's death. Clearly, these statements were being changed to fit the narrative that they wanted to tell about whether or not the father was a horrible person and about how the abuse happened. So why did they accuse Sung-ho of hurting his children? What was the purpose? Well, the first person on record to say that Kim Sung-ho had hurt his children was the uncle. When the police questioned him, he stated that Shin-hye had told him that she killed her father because he was a drunk and sexually assaulted her and her younger sister. Then, she told the police that she gave Sung-ho 30 sleeping pills. Keep in mind, the 30 pills number is perfectly reflected in the autopsy report, which had come out prior to the uncle's confession. It is odd that Shin-hye, if she had killed her father, would recall the exact number of pills, or that the autopsy report would also reflect 30 pills perfectly. It just seemed way too consistent for how shitty the rest of the investigation was going. Then later, the uncle was asked again about the confession and said that he hadn't actually asked for any details, and the only thing he had heard was that Shin-hye killed Sung-ho. Shin-hye and her younger sister told attorney Park that they had been told by their uncle to say that they were molested so that Shin-hye would get leniency in the trial. He yelled at them to lie and say that they were sexually molested repeatedly. These officers were contacted by attorney Park and asked about these false statements and about the violence used against the younger siblings. They denied everything and said they would never hit a minor. As well, the 2 underage siblings were interviewed without a guardian, and they said this never occurred. They even asked the attorney if he was threatening them by making false accusations. The younger brother tried to explain how incomprehensible it was to accuse Shin-hye of killing their father. At the time, she was 155 centimeters or 5'1", and was 38 kilograms or 83 pounds. She was a very petite woman. It was even unlikely that she could have lifted her father out of the car without there being clear signs of him being dragged or dropped out of the car. And he had no such injuries. Everyone in the family believed that Shin-hye was innocent. Her 99-year-old grandfather always believed she was innocent as well. In 2015, he told the attorney, "It's heartbreaking. I cannot sleep when I think of Shin-hye. Why did you arrest innocent Shin-hye without any evidence? I want to see Shin-hye again before I die." Her grandparents have both since passed away. but her brother lived with the grandparents until their passing. Attorney Park continued through the documents, coming to the toxicology report. Park brought the toxicology reports to Professor Kim, who taught medicine at a university. He took one look at the paper and said, "This is so fake, it's funny." If you recall, the medication found in Kim Sang-ho's autopsy was doxylamine. The professor stated that doxylamine wouldn't kill you, even if you took 30 pills. The warning on the pills is to take just one at a time if you experience not being able to sleep, and if you have insomnia, you can take 2 to 3. It says that taking more can result in respiratory distress. The police based the 30 pills on the toxicology report as being what killed him on an American study that was done that 30 pills was enough to kill an adult. But Attorney Park contacted the company and asked about the dosage and asked about if there was a lethal dose. There was no data except for one study, the American study, in which a monkey the size of a child had died from consuming 40 pills worth of the medication. The company and Professor Kim both agreed that this study was done on a monkey. The data can't be related to an adult man. There just wasn't any data on what a lethal dose of doxylamine was. As well, they questioned how could an adult man take 30 pills within an hour and not know it, especially a drunken man. As far as the alcohol in his system, the report stated once that he had an incredibly high blood alcohol content, but the report states he only drank 2 shots of soju, a clear Korean liquor. Someone who was drunk often wouldn't even be buzzed from 2 shots of soju. But the autopsy results say that 30 pills were determined from the microgram per milliliter in his blood. 13.02 microgram per milliliter was detected, and each pill would be close to 0.069 microgram per milliliter. The professor said that it varies by person how quickly medications are metabolized, but the autopsy began 30 hours after Sang-ho's time of death, meaning that this was an even smaller concentration than truly killed him. Blood contains metabolic enzymes that continue to work after you die. In other words, they found the level of doxylamine in his blood 30 hours after his death. This meant it was more than likely he had taken more than 100 pills. It just wasn't likely that a drunken man had taken these pills, or that the pills could have been dissolved into a drink. As well, pills are not sold in mega Costco packs like they are in America. This medication is sold only at pharmacies in small blister packs of maybe 4 or 6 pills. It would have been suspicious if she had been carrying that many pills with her. The report stated that the cause of death was the medication mixed with the alcohol in his system, but Professor Kim doubted that this was true. When an autopsy is performed, the stomach's contents are meticulously examined. They can tell you what seasonings were on your dinner, but they found no trace of medication in his stomach. In the portion of the report, it listed particles of noodles and vegetables. Photos of the contents were also included, and it confirmed that this report seemed fake, and faked by someone without knowledge of medicine. Or they had bribed the medical examiner to lie on the report. The professor asked Attorney Park how this form wasn't vetted by a single other doctor, and Park had to conclude that the autopsy results just were not a part of the trial at all. If it had been examined by any other doctor, they would have noticed that the second document of the doctor who actually performed the autopsy had written that there was mild epidermal damage around the deceased's mouth and nose, meaning he had been suffocated to death. And as interesting as this one detail is, I hate to tell you, but it has not been reinvestigated, and it did not come up in the trial. I learned about this case actually when investigating the last episode regarding Kim Dae-doo, and although not mentioned in the episode, the police also have been accused of framing Kim Dae-doo for many of the murders. As well, The movie Memories of Murder depicts the police's abusive methods of investigation and interrogation. It's a topic that we have covered often. In particular, crime scene reenactment. The suspect visits the crime scenes and must reenact their crimes for the officers. Shin-hye was taken to her father's house and to the crime scene and was told, reenact the crime. She refused. However, they still had to take photos regardless. The first photo shows her crouching, hiding her face outside of her father's home, maybe crying. The police note writes, suspect is knocking on the door of the victim's house, which is not happening, obviously. The next photo shows Shin-hye going up the stairs of the home, but at the edge of the photo, you can see that she is actually being pulled up the stairs by her handcuffs. The next photo shows an officer placing Shin-hye's hands forcibly over a doll representing the victim. She is almost not even in this photo because the officer is reaching over the dummy and her to force her to engage in the reenactment. Then, in the documentation of this, the police state that the victim was at a blood alcohol content of 0.1, 3 times less than what they had written in the autopsy report. Had they already forgotten what they had falsified? They'd also written that Shin-hye had given him 1 bottle of soju, which, for someone, again, who had a high tolerance of alcohol and drank often, 1 bottle of soju would not have raised his blood alcohol content to 0.1, let alone 0.3. The stairs that she had led her inebriated father down, allegedly, is actually a very steep pull-down staircase with no railing. Her father had polio. It would not have been able to walk himself down these steps while inebriated. Then, they put Shin-hye in the car and said, take us to the bus stop. Navigate. However, she didn't know where this bus stop was. She couldn't navigate them there. And when they got to the bus stop, she asked them, are we still in this neighborhood? She didn't even know what district they were in. The dummy used to represent her father was heavy. They made it as heavy as a human body would be. The police said that she pushed the body from the car rather than pull it. Even trying her hardest, with threats of more violence from the police, Shin-hye was unable to push or pull the heavy doll. Attorney Bach was able to get a screenshot from a video taken by journalists who arrived to the crime scene the day his body was discovered, because it was all over the news. The broken turn signal glass was in really large chunks, half of the width of the street away from the body, as if they had just been tossed there. It looked staged. Or the glass could have just been unrelated to the crime at all. Also, one odd thing was that the person who reported the body stated that his shoes had been taken off and placed neatly next to his body. They weren't like flung off, they weren't falling off, they were put next to his body. Despite the police using the glass to show that Shin-hye faked a traffic accident to cover up her crimes, the fragments were not brought in as evidence. They just left them there. There was no preservation of the crime scene at all. As well, no fingerprints, footprints, or evidence was taken from the father or grandmother's home, which would have possibly proven that Shin-hye hadn't been there. Like she said, she hadn't visited their home in a long while, meaning that no DNA, no fingerprints, no hair would be found at the scene. If she had been upstairs with him, it was more than likely hair would be found, as she had long black hair that she was wearing down. The largest piece of missing evidence was the sleeping medication and the glasses. They didn't find any drinking glasses with residue, and there was no evidence of the 40-plus sleeping medication blister packs. On top of this was Shin-hye's missing motive. The motive used in the trial was the life insurance policies taken out in Kim Sang-ho's name. There were 8 of them taken out prior to his death. However, Attorney Park had a life insurance expert review the documents. There actually had been a big mistake made by the judge. At the time of his death, he actually had 15 insurance policies. However, most of these were invalid or expired, so they weren't actually active. Only 5 policies were in effect, which he had taken out to care for his family if he died with Shin-hye's help. Now, Shin-hye admitted that she did help her father sign up for these policies because he had consistently been denied life insurance because of his disability. As well, he died prior to the benefits beginning on any of these policies, so no one would benefit from them. If Shin-hye was so informed about these policies that she signed him up for,